The following passage was found in the London Magnet from the 17th of October 1853, the wreck of the Annie Jane. According to the account of one class of the survivors, she was there run ashore to escape the reef of rocks which formed the opposite entrance to the bay. And, according to the opinion of others, she was forced in by the fury of the gale. Certain it is that within 20 minutes after clearing the reef, and between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning of the 29th alt, the ship took the ground with a fearful concussion.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Many Storms of the Annie Jane?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Annie Jane was one of the many immigrant ships that were engaged in bringing people and goods between the United Kingdom and North America by the mid-1800s. The three-masted wooden vessel had been specially built for that purpose in Quebec only months before her last voyage, though she was owned by Thomas Holderness of Liverpool. The A1 rated 1,294-ton ship had already made her first complete trip across the Atlantic, sailing from Quebec to Liverpool, and now she was sailing once more for Quebec. On board for her return voyage, in addition to her 41-man crew of French-Canadian sailors, was what was estimated to be as many as 450 immigrants from across the United Kingdom. There was also a cargo that included 800 tons of iron intended to help with the expansion of the Canadian Railway. Around 100 of the passengers were workmen, mostly blacksmiths and carpenters, who had been hired to work on the railway. Due to her nature as an emigrant ship, the Annie Jane was also carrying what made up all of the possessions of a majority of her passengers, who were looking to start over on a new continent. On the 23rd of August, the ship departed from Liverpool, but on the 25th, she was met with a heavy gale. The storm and a badly balanced cargo caused the ship to roll badly, and soon she had lost her fore and mizzen topmasts. The Annie Jane was forced to return to Liverpool to be refitted. Even in this short voyage on the Annie Jane, many of the passengers already felt as though they had been mistreated. There had been very little food for the entirety of the short journey, since the food was unreachable due to the pitching of the dangerously loaded ship. Not expecting the ship's owners to do anything that was against their economic interest, the passengers instead complained to the government immigration agent in Liverpool, asking him to do something about how unseaworthy the Annie Jane was. He did nothing in response to their complaints. This was an occurrence that served to spook some of the passengers, and by the time the Annie Jane left port again on the 9th of September to head to Quebec, her passenger list had dropped down to possibly a little under 400, not including children, and her crew was possibly as low as 35 men. On the 12th of September, the Annie Jane once again met with a violent gale. Once again, the Annie Jane lost her fore and mizzen topmasts, and this time the crew also had to cut away the jibboom to clear away the wreckage. For 2 days, the crew of the Annie Jane worked to make temporary repairs, but even with a jury-rigged foreyard, the passengers once again told the captain that they wanted to turn back for better repairs, rather than continue the voyage. This time, Captain Mason waited until nightfall, and then, when the passengers would not notice, he turned their course back towards Quebec rather than return to Liverpool. It was rumored that the decision to continue the voyage was partially influenced by Captain Rose, who was traveling as one of the first-class cabin passengers. If he was partially to blame for the decision, he could hardly be considered an uninvolved party. He was on his way to take command of a different ship for the same owner as the Annie Jane in Quebec. A different account, however, has Captain Mason completely responsible for the decision to continue the voyage himself. In that account, the passengers went so far as to draw up a formal petition with a cabinet maker named Ross as their spokesman, and presented it to the captain asking him to turn around. The passengers even said that they would rather give up the money they had paid for their passage than risk their lives, and that they were not asking for a refund just to be returned to land. Rather than entertaining the desire of his passengers to turn back, it was said that Captain Mason threw the petition overboard and announced that he had no intention of turning back a second time. He did, however, say that he would shoot anyone who did try to take control of the ship. On the 21st of September, once again, the Annie Jane was hit by a gale. The crew was forced to cut away the maintopmast, and the storm took the mainyard. The ship's compass was lost in the storm, as were her lifeboats. And between the storm, the poorly loaded iron in her hold, and her demasted state, the Annie Jane was now almost entirely unmanageable. When they checked to see if she had water in her hold, the newly built ship was found to have taken on 4 feet, and through the night and for the rest of the storm, the crew and the passengers took turns at the pumps. It was only once she was in this state that Captain Mason agreed to turn the ship around and try to reach a safe harbor. The ship had some sails still, but so few that she was described as practically drifting before the storm that continued to toss her for almost a week. When the storm finally moderated a little, they were able to add more sail, even if it meant attaching a piece of canvas to the mizzen rigging, since they lacked yards and masts, and they were able to travel with a little more speed. On the 28th of September, they saw St. Kilda around noon, which may have been a comfort, but by 5 that afternoon it was clear to those on board that a new storm was brewing. They hauled the staysails down and got ready to ride out yet another gale. Just as the winds got even stronger, they spotted the Barra lighthouse, a warning of the dangerous land ahead of them, but the ever-shifting winds were making it impossible for them to keep a safe distance, and carrying them closer and closer to danger. One newspaper would point out that the Barra light was the highest in Great Britain at the time, impossible to miss, but they also admitted that, light or not, if you got among the reefs, it was almost impossible to escape again. About 11:30 on the night of the 28th, Captain Mason was faced with a difficult choice. Near at hand was a small sandy bay, and right next to them was a rocky reef where the waves were violently breaking. Deciding that the only choice was the bay, Captain Mason ordered the course of the ship to be changed. And, surprisingly, Captain Mason managed to round the dangerous reef that had threatened the ship. Unfortunately, this only offered a false sense of security. The exact reason for the Annie Jane grounding was never made entirely clear. Even Thomas Markham, the ship's second mate, who wrote a detailed account for the papers, simply said that the ship grounded about 2 miles from the head of the bay without offering any further reasons. Some newspapers speculated that the wreck had been an accident caused by how unmanageable the ship was, while others speculated that Captain Mason had intentionally grounded the ship on what looked like an attractive sandy beach, because he knew they were sinking anyway. The impact as the ship grounded sent a shuddering shock through the ship. Most of the people on board, crew, officers, and passengers alike, had all been below decks asleep when it occurred. But soon, the decks were full of people who were poorly or completely undressed, and entirely frantic. Second mate Markham would speculate that the speed at which the ship started to break up was caused by the ship striking a reef rather than sand, though he had little proof of this. The later inquest would, instead, blame the culprit that had already haunted the ship, the poorly loaded iron in the hold, which, they said, put more strain on the ship than a simple grounding would have. The panicked passengers and some of the crew made a rush for the boats as soon as it was found that the ship was aground. Though the lifeboats had already been lost in the previous storms, there were still 4 boats on board the Annie Jane. 3 of them were between the mizzenmast and the poop deck, and a 4th was on top of the cookhouse. None of these boats were readily accessible, though. The reason that they had not been lost at the same time as the lifeboats was that they were securely fastened down in such a way that they were not quick to free. Around 100 people crowded into the small area, trying desperately to free the boats for about 5 minutes, until a giant wave smashed over the ship. The first part of the ship to break off under the force of the beating sea was the deckhouse and part of the poop deck. And with it was lost the 100 or so people who had been trying to get the boats. Many of the women and children on board of the ship had remained below decks rather than risk the waves that were sweeping the deck, but this too proved to be a deadly choice. The waves that followed the one that had taken the deckhouse carried with them the ship's mainmast, which smashed through the side of the ship as it went overboard. Meanwhile, the cargo of iron had beaten through the bottom of the ship, weakening the structural integrity of the ship even further. With a rending crash, the remaining portion of the poop deck, as well as some of the other decking, gave away, and crushed the passengers who were still sheltering below deck. It was later found, on inspecting those who washed ashore, that very few of these people had drowned. The ship's deck had been what cut short their lives. Within an hour of grounding, the Annie Jane had broken into 3 distinct pieces. Surprisingly, the people who had been standing on the poop deck when it gave way and fell proved to have been the luckiest. The poop deck made an excellent and seaworthy raft. 7 of the sailors on the ship were also fortunate. They had secured themselves to the topgallant of the forecastle, and this too floated well. The poop deck with its passengers and the forecastle with the 7 sailors were both carried by the waves to the shore of the Isle of Barra, coming to shore around 4 in the morning. When morning broke, they were able to make an account of the survivors. 28 members of the crew were left, as was Captain Mason. The passengers had not fared much better. The survivors were mostly the steerage passengers, and they comprised of 60 men, 12 women, and 1 child. That so many of the steerage men had survived was in part because some of them had already been on the deck out of anxiety when the ship had wrecked. As for the only child to survive the dangerous night, that was due to the mother's efforts. The mother was only stated to be a poor Irish woman who was traveling to join her husband in America, and remained nameless in the accounts of the wreck. But when the ship began to break apart, she tied 1 child on her back, and held the other in her arms. A wave had torn away the child in her arms, but the child tied to her back had been safe. The only child to survive the ordeal. The wreck of the Annie Jane had not gone unnoticed on the Isle of Barra, and at 7 in the morning 8 of the local men came down to offer assistance. It was now low tide, and thanks to the remains of the mizzenmast, which was still attached to the deck, the people on the wreckage and the men of Barra were able to fashion a makeshift bridge for people to climb along to reach the shore. Since it was low tide, some of the people on the wreckage did not even wait for this, and instead jumped into the water, wading ashore with the water coming to their chests. A cart was sent for the women and children, and all 102 people were cast on the generosity of a local farmer. The women and the surviving officers of the ship were allowed to stay in the farmhouse, while the other passengers and sailors were housed in the farm's outbuildings and sheds. The treatment that they received here varied greatly by who was telling the account. Second Mate Markham complained that the servants of the farm treated them with great suspicion, warning them against troubling the pigs they found themselves housed with. He also stated that they went hungry until 11 o'clock at night, when they were provided with some diseased potatoes. This version was undersigned by some of the other members of the crew. Captain Mason, however, stated that provisions were certainly not lacking, since they were able to quickly rescue some of the ship's provisions that had washed ashore, and live off of those. They were also able to clothe the people who had come ashore in states of undress thanks to the trunks that began to wash on the beach. Unfortunately, it was not just material goods that washed on the shore, but also people. Captain Mason headed the efforts to find as many as he could, and eventually, 230 were interred in a mass grave on the beach. The only exception to this burial were the remains of a French-Canadian priest and the ship's first mate, a man named Bell. These two were buried in rough coffins built out of pieces of the wreck in separate graves. No one will ever know the total cost of life from this tragedy, but it is certain that it was greater than the 230 people who were found. Among the people lost were Captain Rose and his wife. He would never take command of the ship waiting for him in Quebec. Also lost was the cabinet maker named Ross, who had been the spokesman for the passengers asking for the ship to be turned around. For the survivors, the fight for justice had just begun. One of the survivors was a sailor named Langlois, a member of the crew. He had not sailed with the Annie Jane from Quebec. He had instead sailed to Liverpool on a ship named the Allan McNab. But when the captain of the Allan McNab decided to sell his ship in Liverpool, he had promised to find Langlois a berth on another ship, so that he would not lose out on any wages. The berth that had been found for Langlois was on the Annie Jane, which had certainly not been the voyage or pay that Langlois was promised, and he took the captain of the Allan McNab to court. After a lengthy legal battle, it was decided by the courts that Langlois was indeed owed money, since he had lost out on wages due to the berth that had been found to replace the one he had had on the Allan McNab. 24 of the other passengers submitted a petition to the government in Liverpool for an official investigation into the Annie Jane, and this was listened to with more attention than they had received from Captain Mason when they had asked him to turn around. The inquiry that followed was opened on the 1st of November, 1853. Among those who were called to the stand were some of the passengers, immigration officials, and the owner of the Annie Jane, as well as Captain Mason himself. The first to speak was the immigration officer, who stated that the complaint of provisions was addressed through monetary compensation, and that this was actually done above and beyond what was necessary. Once it was felt that the initial complaint to the immigration office had been acknowledged, the inquiry moved on to the actual wreck of the vessel. The findings of the inquiry blamed how little of the crew there was to manage a ship of such a size, especially in the fall, when there were often bad storms. The inquiry also placed blame, however, on the fact that the crew was French-Canadian, who, as a whole, the inquiry claimed, were not willing to go aloft. A statement that seems very unlikely. To the claim of the passengers that at one point Captain Mason had at one point prophetically announced that they would go to Quebec or to the bottom, the inquiry waved this off as having been spoken in anger, though they did say that the ship should have been turned around when it was damaged. One of the few things that everyone could agree on was that the cargo of iron had been poorly stored. And the first solution to this that was recommended was that ships carrying large amounts of iron simply should not double as immigrant ships. The head of the inquiry found this too drastic of a solution, and, instead, suggested that possibly licensing stevedores to ensure their competence and care was a better choice. All complaints by the passengers that the ship had been overloaded and overcrowded were entirely dismissed, openly stating that it was simply the condition of all immigrant ships, and that to address it, in this case, would mean addressing it in all. The inquiry ended with the praising of the immigrant officers, the hard work that they did, and their willingness to furnish testimony, but without any clear resolution for the passengers, who had lost everything, including, in many cases, their families.
For the account of Second Mate Markham, please see the London Standard from October 25th, 1853, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.